Chapter 16. "Come on, Holly," pleaded Becky. "It'll be okay. It's a beautiful spring day, and you need to get out more." Becky knew better than to suggest that it would be fun. Nothing was fun for Holly without Sasha, and Sasha had to stay in the dorms. So, outside of meals and classes, Holly stayed in the dorms too. She still couldn't block, and could only briefly deal with the loud press of student emotions that filled the halls. So she avoided it all as much as possible. "We haven't seen Hagrid for ages," Becky added. "There's rarely anybody around his place, so you won't have to deal with a lot of emotions. Maybe you would be more successful practicing your blocking with fewer people around." Professor Lovegood kept Holly in the classroom, studying, learning all sorts of spells while the other students did wand work in the practice room. Holly was supposed to try to block whenever an injury occurred. So far, Holly had failed dismally, but at least the other students couldn't see her wince with pain at each injury. Richards glowered at her constantly during class, but otherwise left her alone. "You know the Slytherins don't really like Hagrid, so you won't have to worry about them hanging around to bother you either." The Slytherins hadn't done much since that wizard duel with Richards. Holly wasn't sure why. Maybe all their defensive efforts had worked. Maybe professors had talked to them. Maybe the Slytherins had just decided she wasn't worth the effort. At any rate, when Holly scanned the great halls each morning before she started humming, she could only feel the cool disdain that usually marked the presence of Slytherins. "I checked," Becky added encouragingly. "Your cousins will be coming too." Holly hadn't talked much to them since she had left Sasha behind in the dorms. She hadn't talked much to anyone outside of the Hufflepuffs in the dorm. "Please, do it for me." Holly sighed and rubbed Sasha behind the ears. Sasha had happily stretched herself out in front of Holly, asking for a belly rub. Holly absently complied. Becky had been a good friend, spending much of her time in the dorms with Holly. Holly never asked her to stay, but she had anyway. The two had gotten quite good at wizard chess and King's Corner. Becky hadn't complained at all, though Holly knew she would have rather been outside doing other things, like watching the Quidditch practice and soaking up the sun. It was time for Holly to be a good friend in return. "Okay," said Holly reluctantly. "I'll go, but only for a while." She stood up and followed Becky out of the room. "She's coming," Becky said happily to Mark. Mark had been in the common room, waiting for a response. He grinned when he heard the news. The two hustled Holly out the dorms before she had a chance to change her mind. They made their way down the stairs. The halls were empty. First-year Hufflepuffs and Gryffindors had Thursday afternoons off, but the other students were still in class or in libraries studying. The emotions were too remote to bother Holly. The sun shone brightly outside. The castle walls were lined with newly sprouted white and pink coral bells. Sprinkled between them were blazing red and yellow fire bells. When the wind blew, all the flower bells swayed back and forth, making gentle harmonies. Miniature snapdragons of all colors lay hidden and still in the large lawn. They flashed and twinkled like colorful stars when quickly snapping at any flying insect, and then hid again beneath the green of other grasses, awaiting the arrival of their next meal. Mossy shy plants with maroon and silver leaves carpeted the pathway towards herbology. So sensitive, the plants could tell when a foot was about to land on top of them. They would curl up and shrink, allowing the foot to land on the bare stone, only to stretch out their tiny branches and leaves, totally covering the stone after the foot lifted. The shy plants undulated back and forth over the path like ocean waves while the three walked. The students walked carefully over the dirt path near the greenhouse. The hairy toads now living there blended in well with the sandy color of the dirt. They were so numerous they were hard to avoid, but no one wanted to squash a hairy toad, even by accident. Mark accidentally stepped on one once. It exploded under his foot like a popping balloon, releasing a cloud of yellow-green gas that smelled like rotting fish and cheese. The cloud hovered above Mark's foot, clinging to his leg like a magnet. It took over an hour for the cloud to dissipate. Meanwhile, the flies loved the smell of the cloud so much they swarmed around Mark, and the hairy toads hopped after him to get at the flies. On either side of the dirt path were two neat rows of bright yellow fly traps and a series of blue starflowers in between. They tried to catch the flies and fleas the hairy toads missed. The starflowers opened their petals wide, emitting a perfume that smelled like rotting meat to attract the insects. Each fly trap opened wide, showing their scarlet interiors to the sky, awaiting the next bug. The fly traps were only about 30 centimeters tall. The yellow traps with their spiky teeth swayed in the wind and nibbled at ankles that got too close to the edge of the path. Mark said he'd read they would grow as large as 2 feet and could get quite annoying by snapping at anyone who passed by. Despite the toads and traps, the sand fleas remained. It would take the winter freeze to totally get rid of them. At least they hadn't spread. It wasn't unusual for people to each get 1 or 2 bug bites as they passed. The bites were no big deal now, as everyone, even the Slytherins, carried a jar of anti-itch potion when they went to herbology. A huge clump of ornamental blue-green grass marked the turnoff to Hagrid's hut. It was over 6 feet tall, with even taller, frilly, sky-blue flowers that swayed gently in the wind. "Don't let it touch you," cautioned Becky as they rounded the corner. "Why not?" asked Holly curiously, while giving the plant a wide berth. The clump of grass hadn't been there her last visit. "That's tickle grass," explained Becky. "Rose warned me about it when I asked her about this visit. She said Professor Longbottom planted it to put students in a better mood when they attended the Care of Magical Creatures class. It releases a blue pollen when the wind blows that makes everyone near it feel all giggly." "What's wrong with that?" wondered Holly aloud as they continued walking. "Well, Rose apparently got too close to it, and the grass blades reached out and grabbed her. It pulled her into the plant and started shaking pollen all over her. Rose was laughing so hard that she couldn't stop. Albus and his friend Taylor O'Donnell had to pull her out of the plant. By the time Rose got out, she was totally blue with pollen and so weak from laughter, and still laughing, that they had to carry her to the infirmary to get the pollen washed off." Holly sighed. Even the nice plants weren't all that nice around here. Strangely enough, the thought made her want to laugh. Probably the effect of all the pollen in the air. Hagrid was indeed happy to see them, and welcomed the trio when they appeared. Fang gave a running charge and literally knocked Holly over, enthusiastically giving her face a thorough drenching by tongue for a greeting. Holly laughed as she wiped her face off. He was certainly a very happy dog. Happy cat, happy dog. Good work. Holly closed her eyes and reached out with her senses. Yes, she could feel a certain contentment around Fang. Holly relaxed and let his happiness surround her. Not as good as Sasha, but Holly found muted emotions of any form a welcome relief outside of the dorms. She did tire of humming all the time. Albus and Rose had already arrived. Hagrid invited them all inside for tea. The 5 squished into the chairs. Holly kept Fang nearby, continuously scratching his ears. Hagrid already had the table cleared and the water on the fire. Soon he filled 5 mugs of steaming hot brew and passed out a biscuit to each. All 5 biscuits quickly vanished beneath the folds of their robes for later use in potions. "I like your new hairstyle, Becky," commented Rose while she sipped some tea. "It looks really good." Becky flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "Thanks," she said, smiling. "Holly helped with it." While closeted up in the dorms, Holly had been practicing spells from the book Professor Lovegood had loaned her. Some of the spells, such as longer eyelashes, which grew so long they drooped over Marcy's nose, and stronger fingernails, which thickened and hardened to claw-like consistency, had to be undone almost immediately. But others became quite popular. Several of the Hufflepuff students had received anti-acne hexes. Susan had some of her freckles hexed to match her skin color so they wouldn't show. Then Holly had fixed up some tiger moth hair clips for her. And Becky? Well, this week Holly had hexed a gentle curl into her usually straight brown hair and added some gold and auburn highlights. They had brushed the hair out and pinned it back behind each ear using fragrant, fresh plumeria flower clips. The anti-tangle hex kept the hair reasonably neat despite the breeze outdoors. Hagrid pulled out a pile of brochures and asked the students to look them over. They seemed to describe animal preserves. "Tell me which one you like the best," he asked them. "Why?" inquired Rose. "Headmistress McGonagall told me I'd have to find a new home for Cuddles." "Really?" exclaimed Mark. "How come?" "She says he's gotten too big to keep on the school grounds," lamented Hagrid. "He's only a few centimeters over 4 meters long, but she thinks that anything over 4 meters is too much." "That's too bad," said Albus solemnly. "How long is he now, anyway?" 4 meters, 98 centimeters long, said Hagrid proudly. He's a fine-looking lizard, if I say so myself. You don't seem too upset about this, observed Holly quietly. Fang had moved up closer so she could rub his neck and chest. Hagrid sighed. To tell you the truth, Cuddles hasn't been looking too happy lately. I think he's lonely. I've been looking for a lady friend for him, but no one seems to have one they can send up this way. He pulled out one of the brochures and laid it on top of the rest for the group to examine. What do you think of this thermal spring Iceland preserve? It's pretty close by, and I could visit him whenever I want. Well, commented Mark, it looks warm and cozy, but it doesn't look like they have any lady friends for him there. I don't think it's a regular place where lizards like to hang out. I like this Anik Krakatoa preserve, said Holly. It's at a nice warm climate, and the brochure says it's a deserted island. Cuddles could spit to his heart content without bothering anyone. But it says here they have fire lizards living there, commented Rose while watching the moving images of the island on the brochure. Do you think fire lizards and spitting lizards will get along? No one knew. They shuffled through the rest of the brochures, looking at each one. I think your best bet is this jungle preserve in Central Africa, concluded Mark, setting that brochure on the top of the pile. It has a nice warm climate and lots of area to roam. Oh, said Becky excitedly as she watched the moving overview of the preserve. Isn't that a spitting lizard in the shadows? They rewound the overview, stopping it at the right point, and studied the animal carefully. Yes, it's definitely a spitting lizard, concluded Hagrid excitedly. That's just the place to send him. Wait till I tell Cuddles. Albus, why were you late to class today? Asked Holly while Hagrid put the brochures away. It was nothing much, answered Albus. Holly stared at Albus with her green eyes. It was more than that, she disagreed. What happened? She asked, insisting on a more specific answer. He looked down. I can't keep anything from you, can I? He said flatly. Not much, agreed Holly, rubbing the fur under Fang's ears. Fang sighed in contentment. What happened? Well, Malfoy and Richards were lying in wait for us along the way to class and tried to cast some spells, but we were faster. Taylor used Pacificus Totalis on Tony. You should have seen him fall. And I did a bat bogey hex on Scorpius. It looked real good on him, too. That's all, he concluded. I'm so sorry, began Holly. They probably wouldn't have tried anything if it weren't for me. Don't be silly, exclaimed Albus. They weren't picking on me because of you. I'm a Potter, remember? That's enough reason for them. It was nothing, really. Except you got caught, reminded Rose accusingly. Well, so did they, retorted Albus defensively. Oh, no, breathed Becky. What happened? They all got detention, of course, said Rose. But only for one day, added Albus. We'll be with Mrs. Figg, the caretaker, tonight. She was Dad's next-door neighbor for a long time ago. She likes Dad. It shouldn't be too bad. That's what we thought about detention with Professor Longbottom, said Rose darkly. Hello, anybody there? James had arrived from his classes. He knocked on the door and came on in without waiting for an invitation. Hello there, he greeted everyone. Hi, Hagrid, he said cheerfully. Pull up a chair, James, greeted Hagrid while getting out another mug. Want some tea? Sure, replied James, dragging an old trunk to the table and sitting on it. Hey, Holly, he added. It's good to see you out and about. Holly nodded and petted Fang some more. So, Hagrid, began James, settle on a place for Cuddles yet? Hagrid told me about Cuddles during class, he explained to the others. Yep, replied Hagrid happily as he handed James his tea and a lumpy biscuit. James took the mug and the biscuit. When Hagrid wasn't looking, James handed the biscuit over to Rose, who quickly tucked it away. Got me a nice place all picked out for him. The others helped me select it. He pulled out the brochure and handed it to James. Check it out. I thought you were leaning towards the thermal spring, said James as he reviewed the brochure. He was, confirmed Becky, but then we saw the spitting lizard in the pictures of this place, and we thought he'd be happier there. She pointed out the lizard in the brochure. James nodded approvingly. Looks like a good choice, he said. Then he turned to Albus. So, what's this I hear about you getting detention? He asked conversationally. Albus flushed. Sheesh, he said. You can't keep anything a secret around here. Apparently not, agreed James affably while taking a sip of tea from the mug, especially when you do it right in front of Mrs. Figg. I ran into Mrs. Figg on the way over here, and she told me all about it. You really need to be more observant as to who is around, sunning themselves on the grounds when you cast your spells. Well, they deserved it, said Albus defensively. That's what Mrs. Figg said, agreed James. But you still broke the rules. She said you and Taylor will be with her tonight cleaning up the trophy room. It hasn't been touched in years. You got off lucky." James put down his mug on the table. "Mrs. Figg said that Professor Slughorn will handle the detention for Richards and Malfoy. She said Professor Slughorn mentioned something about the girls' bathroom needing to be fixed up." James looked around the room at the group. "Can't imagine what happened to the Slytherin's girls' bathroom that would require a detention to repair. Do any of you know?" Holly looked down quickly so James couldn't see her face. Mark choked on his tea and put the mug down quickly. Becky coughed and started turning red. Began Holly, still looking intently at her mug. "Moaning Myrtle kind of got mad at them one day." "Oh," said James. "That would explain things." "Speaking of bathrooms," spoke up Rose, changing the subject, "is it true you fixed up Moaning Myrtle's bathroom? I overheard a couple of Slytherin girls laughing about how you had to do it for in-class detention." "Well, yeah, I did fix the bathroom," replied Holly, "but it wasn't really a detention," she explained. "I just couldn't do the regular work assigned at the time." "Well, the out-of-order sign is still up," continued Rose conversationally, "but I took a quick peek inside to see how you'd done. The interior is spectacular. You'd never know it was out of order. You did a marvelous job picking up and repairing and cleaning." Thanks," mumbled Holly, not looking at Rose. "I especially like the tiles you found to replace the damaged ones," added Rose innocently. "They go so well with the rest of the decor. However did you find them?" "Well, Myrtle helped," replied Holly, uncomfortably looking down at her mug. "I'm not surprised," replied Rose cheerfully. "Something tells me that Tony and Scorpius will have a harder time than they expect trying to repair that bathroom." Holly quickly gulped down some more tea without responding. James noted the exchange with interest. Mark, Becky, and Holly were staring intently into their mugs, trying to look interested in their tea, a hint of red creeping up their necks. Rose had a twinkle in her eye and looked about ready to burst. Albus looked thoroughly confused. "I think I need to pay a visit to Myrtle's bathroom one of these days," he said thoughtfully after watching the group. "Are you kidding?" exclaimed Albus. "That's a girl's bathroom. You can't go in there." James laughed. "But how else will you know how the other half lives? Hey, Hagrid," he said quickly, changing the subject before Albus could inquire further, "do you think it would be okay if we paid Cuddles a visit before you have to send him off?" Hagrid pulled out a huge dirty rag and blew his nose. "That's a great idea," he said. "I think he'd be pleased to see y'all." So everyone put up their mugs and went outside. Hagrid led the way. James hung back and walked with Holly, who was still petting Fang. Fang soaked up the extra attention like a sponge, never leaving Holly's side. James watched the two together. "That's kind of cheating, you know," he commented quietly to Holly as they walked. Holly sighed and removed her hand from Fang. Fang gave her a disappointed look and then loped off to join the rest of the group. The loud mix of emotions, though friendly, immediately grew stronger and pressed in around her. Holly began humming under her breath. "I just can't seem to block," she complained to James. Holly had been called into the infirmary the previous week. Madame Pomfrey had gotten a response from the other empath concerning how to block. The empath's explanation was brief, and it hadn't helped Holly much. She had written saying, "The other emotions and feelings you sense are like other personalities trying to take over. You must be very secure in who you are, exert your own personality, and use it to block out the emotions of others. Good luck. I know you can do it." Holly knew who she was, but she could tell it best with Sasha. Knowing it sure hadn't helped block any emotions. "You'll get it one of these days," replied James encouragingly. "It just takes time. Think of all the things you couldn't do before you came to Hogwarts, and how much you've learned already." He glanced ahead. "Look, Hagrid's built an observation post." Holly looked up. At the edge of Cuddles' pen, Hagrid had placed a rickety-looking ladder tied with ropes that led to a platform that was level with the top of the wall. Mark and Albus had already scrambled up it. James and Holly reached the wall just as Rose had finished going up the ladder. James gave Holly a boost up and then followed her up the ladder. Hagrid tossed a huge chunk of unidentifiable meat into the center of the pen and then joined them up on the top of the platform. He sat down in a huge chair placed there and pulled out a flute. "Can't take him for walks any more," lamented Hagrid, "but he likes it when I play some music for him." He began to play his flute for Cuddles. The gentle rippling notes contrasted starkly with the huge creature below. "Man, he's big," said Holly, who hadn't seen him since detention. Cuddles had a long body that was thicker than the huge tree trunk. It was dark emerald green in color, with a bright orange and red belly. When Cuddles moved, it looked as if he were on fire, with flickering orange and red flames beneath the green. His tail swung menacingly back and forth like a huge green club with every step. Cuddles moved a lot, circling the enclosures, pausing briefly at the huge smoking fires, only to pace some more. He stopped frequently to spit. The walls were covered with lizard spit, but they held firm. Then Cuddles would pace some more. "Yep," said Hagrid proudly, putting away his flute. "I sure will be sorry to see him go." "What will you do then?" asked Mark. "Well," speculated Hagrid, "you all made such a nice pin, it seems a shame to waste it. I was thinking of digging it out some more and filling it all up with water. Maybe I could try my hand at raising sharks or barracudas." "How about some lions or bears?" suggested Becky hopefully. "Nah," said Hagrid thoughtfully. "Too tame. Maybe I could find a kraken to raise." Holly walked back to the dorms with Becky and Mark. She had just finished dinner with them. It hadn't been such a bad afternoon visiting Hagrid, getting out and about. Maybe she would try it again sometime, but not any time soon. Constantly dealing with emotions was exhausting. She looked forward to some peace and quiet with Sasha. The three reached the portrait guarding their dorms. The gruff judge looked angrily out at them. "Password?" he demanded fiercely. The trio looked at each other. Who would speak first? I know," said Holly. "What gets wetter the more it dries?" "What?" said the judge impatiently. "A towel," replied Holly cheerfully. The judge looked like he was about to explode. "Good one," approved Mark. And all three of them laughed along with the judge as he opened the door. Later, Holly sat in the common room with Sasha on her lap. The huge fire in the fireplace burned cheerfully, heating the room. She reviewed her notes for the next day while stroking Sasha. When she had finished, she got ready for bed. It was still early, but it had been a long, trying day, and she felt very tired. Holly put on her nightgown, put her wand in the drawer in the nearby end table, got into bed, and pulled up her blanket. It may be spring during the day, but it was still cold at night. Sasha curled up next to her, purring loudly. Soon Holly was fast asleep. Meanwhile, Albus and Taylor reported for detention. Mrs. Figg was waiting for them with her 5 cats in the entryway. Her gray hair was tucked neatly in a hairnet. She wore a comfortable-looking blue and pink plaid house robe and purple-striped carpet slippers. She led the 2 boys to the trophy room. There was an assortment of cleaning supplies waiting for them. "No wands will be necessary for tonight," she announced. "Use elbow grease only." She set them to work cleaning. There were several crystal display cases in the room. Each was filled with all sorts of cups, shields, plates, and statues. Each case had to be cleaned, inside and out. All the items within had to be cleaned or dusted and or polished. "And when you finish with that," she announced, "you will need to take care of the walls. Sweep them good and get all the dust and cobwebs off." The 2 boys sighed. It looked like a lot of work. They still had an astronomy to attend at midnight. Mrs. Figg warned them that her detention was the job, not the hours. They would have to return the next night to finish if necessary, and they didn't want to do that. Taylor opened the first display case, and Albus started removing the items within. The gold ones only needed a light dusting. The silver needed polishing. After a while, Mrs. Figg left to make her rounds, but 2 of her cats, Snowball and Poopsie, remained to watch them work. Poopsie, a tortoiseshell cat with yellow eyes, would let out a screeching yowl whenever she noted a streak or an unclean spot in the boys' work. Albus quickly learned to show Poopsie everything he had polished and thought finished before returning it to the case. It saved his ears and kept them from having to pull a trophy or a plate that didn't pass cat muster out again. Snowball was an all-white, long-haired cat with deep blue eyes. She paced in and out, inspecting their efforts, shedding long strands of white hair everywhere. Taylor, who was dusting and cleaning out the cases, complained that Snowball made more work for both of them. When Taylor finished with the cases, he helped Albus clean and polish the trophies. Finally, all that remained were the walls. They each grabbed a broom and took a side and started sweeping. "Hey," said Taylor, stopping his work and looking closer at the wall. "Isn't your mum's name Jenny?" he asked Albus. "Yes," replied Albus, stopping what he was doing to look at Taylor. "Why?" "I think there's a plaque on the wall with her name on it." He put down the broom and fetched a rag. "Ginny Weasley, right?" he asked, scrubbing something on the wall. "Right," agreed Albus, moving closer to look for himself. "You didn't tell me she had an award in here." "I didn't know." Albus looked up at the wall where Taylor was working. There was a small heart-shaped plaque set into the wall, silver by the look of it, and very dirty. He could hardly see the letters inscribed in it, but that did look like the words Ginny Weasley, written on the top line. Taylor continued cleaning away. "Look," he exclaimed, "there's your dad's name on it, too. I didn't know there were any plaques in here with your dad's name." "Me neither," agreed Albus curiously. "What's the rest of it say?" He squished in for a closer look, but Taylor shoved him aside. "Hold on there," Taylor said. "Let me get it finished." Albus stepped aside and let Taylor finish working. "There," said Taylor after a few minutes of hard cleaning. "All done." He had the heart-shaped plaque polished to mirror-like consistency. It gleamed and sparkled in the candlelight. The lines of the writing had been scratched in with something thin and could not easily be read. Taylor, being taller than Albus, read the inscription aloud. It says, "Ginny Weasley, Harry Potter, and Tom Riddle, now and forever." "Who is Tom Riddle?" Taylor asked Albus. "I don't know," replied Albus, thoroughly puzzled. "I've never heard of him before. Let me look." Taylor moved back for Albus. Albus had to stand on his toes to get a closer look at the plaque and its writing. He could see his green eyes reflected on the highly polished surface. They seemed to glow weirdly back at him. He reached out with a finger and touched the reflective surface. Albus's whole body began to fade, growing more and more transparent with every second. Then he vanished completely. Holly dreamed she was standing knee-deep in a snowdrift. Snow was everywhere. No houses, no trees, nothing but snow, as far as the eye could see. The sky was a solid gray. Huge flakes of snow fell around her. Everything was still and quiet and cold. She was all alone in the snow, and very cold. Holly pulled a cloak around her for warmth, but it was an invisible cloak. She not only couldn't see it, she couldn't feel it. She was so cold. Suddenly, Holly started sliding. Down she went in the cold snow, landing with a heavy clatter and thunk. That woke Holly up. She found herself lying on the floor, a very cold floor. How had that happened? Shivering, Holly felt around in the dark, trying to figure out things. It felt as if her bed had broken. At least it was no longer level, and tipped back and forth when she touched it. Sasha! Was Sasha all right after the fall? Holly couldn't feel Sasha anywhere, not with her hands or her mind. "I need some light. That would help," thought Holly, trying to suppress the surge of panic she was feeling. Maybe Sasha was somewhere injured. Holly reached about, feeling for her wand, feeling for the end table that held her wand. She couldn't find it. Holly stumbled all around her bed, feeling in the dark, hunting for the table, but it didn't seem to be there. Her wand wasn't there. A faint rustling, scratching sound broke the stillness. What was it? "Hello?" Holly called out uncertainly. "I can't see. Is anyone there?" Only silence answered her calls. Holly took an uncertain step forward away from her bed and towards where the sound had come. She stretched out her hands to feel for unseen objects. Holly took another step. Something was on the floor. She tripped and fell. Holly lay where she had fallen and curled herself up into a tight ball. She felt cold, ever so cold, and very, very scared. It was dark all around her, but all the darkness in the world couldn't hide what Holly had already knew with her senses. Wherever she was very much alone.